Rolling dice is a core part of playing miniature wargaming. But is randomness really a good thing? Or would it be better to have more predictability? I'm Matthew from Mini Wargaming, and I want to talk about randomness and predictability, if you couldn't tell. I want to talk about why it's a good thing and where it often isn't a good thing. Now, right off the bat, we can know for sure that a game does not have to have really any randomness in order to be fun. We know this because of the most famous game called chess, or one of the most famous games called chess, where the only real randomness in that game is who goes first. And that has an impact, but a rather minor one, especially if you're not a grandmaster. And that game is awesome. There is a ton of tactical depth. There is a lot of replayability, surprisingly, for a game that appears to not have a lot of permutations. It has way more than I had ever realized until I had watched The Queen's Gambit and really learned all the intricacies of it. I thought I knew it from playing a lot as a kid, but man, I did not know chess. But one thing that chess doesn't have are those random times where you go, ah! Although I guess that could still happen when your opponent does something so awesome. So either way, we know that randomness is not required for a game. There are plenty of video games that don't have randomness. I look at like StarCraft as opposed to Warcraft. StarCraft, when you fire a gun and it has a certain amount of damage, it does that amount of damage. It doesn't roll to hit, it always hits. Whereas Warcraft, it has a random amount of damage. Or the older StarCraft versus StarCraft 2. The older StarCraft, if you're firing up a hill, there was a chance that you would miss, whereas the new one, it doesn't do that anymore. We can have the discussions about which one is better, and it doesn't really matter because subjectively, people are going to like one or the other. But what I want to talk about is where in wargaming randomness is a good thing and where it is not. So obviously, the role of randomness, pun intended, is to create that uncertainty that makes games so fun. You probably can think to some of your favorite moments in your games, and most likely they are due to some random chance. That 6+ you had to roll that was going to determine whether you won the game. Or rolling a 1 when you just needed a 2+ to win the game. Or going back to older editions of Warhammer 40K where they had a random game length. You didn't know if you were going to play a 6th or a 7th turn. And if you played a 6th turn, you were going to lose. But if you didn't, you're going to win. That's actually a first question for the comments. Is that a good mechanic? Or is that a bad example of a random mechanic? I'll let you talk about that in the comments, and I'll talk about it in a few minutes. So obviously you have a bit of a trade-off with this. If you have too much randomness, this can frustrate players. I remember when I first really got into miniature wargaming, not as a kid playing Battletech with Dave, but as an adult playing Lord of the Rings with Dave, and later on Warhammer 40K with Dave and a lot of other people. I remember getting frustrated at the randomness of it, feeling that I was such a tactical genius that should be rewarded. But I found that as I played other games that had less randomness, I'm looking at War Machine. When I switched to that game, it's a 2d6 system. In other words, you roll 2 dice and you add them together. And that gives us a bell curve of probabilities rather than a flat non-curve of probabilities. It means it's more reliably going to be in the middle of that curve, around 6 to 8, rather than you have just as much chance of rolling a 6 as you do a 1. And I thought that would be great. Now, War Machine is a super fun game. I really, really liked that game. But what I found was that it fostered a much more competitive spirit. Because people could predict things, they became obsessed with setting up the perfect armies and the perfect combos. And now, let's just step back a second. War Machine, I think, one of the reasons it had that was because of the 2d6 system. Another, though, was because of things like caster kill and the line of sight rules and all of that too. So it's not just the less randomness that created that, but I think it was part of that reason. And I found myself not enjoying it quite as much because I had to think a lot harder, which is a funny thing to say when you're playing a tactical game like War Machine or Warhammer 40K, that you have to think more. But unless you're going to play all the time, you are going to have a hard time against people who play more than you. The same reason I don't really play multiplayer games and video games is because I don't have the time to get really good at them. I'd rather just play against a computer and be able to dial up or down their difficulty and just have some fun. And that's something I've kind of learned as I've gotten older and played these games, is that while I am competitive, I am not a competitive player, which just basically means that I prefer more narrative and thematic games where I still try to win, than games where I'm trying to min-max every last thing. If I'm trying to min-max every last thing, then all of a sudden the randomness of the dice can get really annoying, because that's something that's unpredictable in all of your planning. Whereas if you're just trying to have a narrative experience, then the dice help to tell those stories. Now, of course, if you have too much randomness, then it removes any skill or player agency, and that's frustrating as well. Let's first off talk about where randomness can work well, and then I'll go on to talk about places where I think it is not used the best way. So the first and foremost, and maybe most obvious, although maybe you're not thinking about it, is in combat resolution. We need to roll to see if somebody is going to get hurt by an attack. Now, I say that, and yet in the back of my mind, and on my list of games that I want to create, is a game that actually doesn't roll dice, and instead just compares things, and so it's situational. But that's getting ahead of myself, and that's not really the point of this video. But we need some sort of system to determine if one model or unit hurts another unit. Now there's different ways to do this, of course. You know, you have Warhammer's approach, which is you roll a hit, and then anything that hits, you roll a wound, and anything that wounds, they maybe get to try to roll a save against that. Or you might have War Machine's approach, where you roll dice to see if you hit, and then you roll dice to see how much damage you do. Not so much if you damage or not, but how much damage, although you could still do no damage as well. Then you have things like dice pool systems, where it's about not just if you hit, but how well you hit, a degrees of success kind of thing. But either way, they all have something in common, where they are rolling randomly to see if an action you are taking, in this case usually attacking, has the intended consequence. So that makes sense, and it's usually well accepted in games that that is something that you want. Now, where the debate might come in is how much randomness you want, or how many dice you're going to be rolling, or how many different things you have to do. Should it be a hit, then a wound, then a save? Or should it just be a hit, then a save? Should you be using D6s or D12s or D20s? All of these different things are good discussions to have, and honestly, you're not going to find one right answer. It's going to depend on what the game is trying to achieve, and whether you're playing with a lot of models, a few models, the theme of the game, how fast you want the game to go, etc., etc. Now, this next one might be a little controversial, but another place that I really like randomness in is in the scenario creation. And that is that you roll randomly for what kind of missions you have, like the Open War deck for Warhammer 40k, or even like the Maelstrom of War deck when it first came out, of the 36 different objectives that you would draw throughout the game. Now, some people really didn't like this. In fact, I remember when the Maelstrom of War deck came out, there was a lot of complaints that I don't have control over the mission. I'd rather know exactly what I have to do. And hey, if that's what you want, there were missions to do that. The Eternal War missions, where it's just grab these objectives by the end of the game, or kill more than your opponent, whatever it is that you want to do. There was also complaints within it that some of the cards would reward you random victory points. So if you slayed the Warlord, for example, it gave you D3 victory points. So one person might roll a 1, and the other person doing exactly the same thing would roll a 3. So this is a good example of where the randomness might be good and where it's not so good. Because I kind of agree that the D3 part wasn't great. I liked it, but at the same time I'm like, yeah, you know what, just make it 2. And that's what they did in some of the tournament scenes, is that they would still use the cards, but you would only get 2 victory points for that, not D3. And so that way you were guaranteed a certain amount. So your randomness was replaced by some predictability, which I understand. Now, later on though, when they had that deck of cards, they came out with new rules that let you control which cards you had, to remove some of them, or to build a deck of only 18. And to me, as much as there was some fun in that, it lost a bit of the spirit of the whole point of it, which was to have that unpredictability, which forced you to build more balanced lists, rather than like the match play scenarios we have now in Warhammer 40k, where it's like you need to make sure you bring a unit that can do this thing, and a unit that can do this thing, and a unit that can do this thing. And not in some fun, balanced way, but in a way that basically has you never touching half of your codex, because there's a better version of the thing that can get behind enemy lines, or the thing that can go to the corners of the map and do this action, or ridiculous things like the Biowar shooting a spore mine, which then does an action, even though they've never been able to do actions before, and whatever happens to be. So I do like randomness in that way. it makes the game way more interesting for me. Essentially, by having that randomness outside of obvious things like if you're going to roll the hit or not, creates that uncertainty that allows players to just enjoy themselves and not plan out 10 steps ahead. Because if you don't know what the results of the next couple steps are going to be, then you don't have to think of the other 8 steps after that, and you can just enjoy yourself a lot more. And then of course you can have special missions and stuff for tournament play where it dials down that randomness and focuses a bit more on the list building and on the decisions you make during the game. Now, there are some places where I think randomness can be problematic, or at least where it's controversial whether it's problematic. The first one are charge moves. So pretty much every game has some sort of charge mechanic, whether it's a fixed charge, like when you charge, you move 6 inches. Get into base contact, you have now charged. Others, like Warhammer 40K, where you have a random charge. Roll 2d6, that's how far you charge, from 2 inches to 12 inches. Or somewhere in between, where maybe it's like Warhammer Fantasy, where it's your movement plus d6. So if you're fast, you're gonna at least do that minimum charge, whereas if you're slow, your minimum charge is gonna be much smaller. Now, I've seen arguments for and against random charges, and I even have arguments for and against them, depending on the game. For example, in Warhammer Fantasy, there were editions where charges were fixed. And so what I would see happen is that one player would move their army up just outside of charge distance so that that army wouldn't be able to charge them. And then on their next turn, they'd be able to move up and then charge, or they would be forced to stay back forever and they'd be able to have too much control over the movement phase of that game, which was by far the most important phase of Warhammer Fantasy. And that's obviously not good. So introduce random charges. Now you can still do a similar thing with random charges. You know that their maximum charge is this, so you stay just outside of that. Or on average their charge is this, so let's go a little closer. But that uncertainty makes it so that you're not having as much control over every aspect of the movement in that game. But maybe that's a bad thing. I have played games that have both random charges and fixed charges and enjoyed both. So, I don't know, what do you think? Should charges be random or should they be fixed? Or maybe somewhere in between? Another one, speaking of Warhammer Fantasy, although it's not exclusive to it, is whether you roll randomly for powers that guys have. Like for example, wizards in Warhammer Fantasy randomly determine which spells they know before the game starts. Not when you're doing your list building, but when you go to play. Now, if I were playing once a month, showing up for a 3 or 4 hour game, only to roll a spell that's really not going to synergize with my list, that's rather a big bummer. I would rather be able to choose my spells. Having said that, the game itself was probably not designed so that each spell was perfectly equivalent. So what they would have to do then is assign points values to each spell so that if you always want to choose the most powerful one, it costs you more points than the other ones. You see that in the cost of magic items or enhancements in 40K or Old World or other games as well. I get that. I get why you would want one or the other. For me though, if you switched over to campaign mode, where you're playing a bunch of games and your guys upgrade in between, I actually prefer random upgrades. Now, not totally random. I don't want my guy that shoots to get some close combat upgrade. So maybe it would be more like there are close combat upgrades and shooting upgrades. And then you say, I want a close combat upgrade, then you randomly determine. And that way you can't perfectly plan out what the story is of those individual units and models. I really enjoy that. So that's where I would want randomness in choosing powers or upgrades. So that one's a little trickier because one-off games, you probably want a little less randomness when it comes to creating your list. That's essentially what you're doing when you're picking your spells as part of list building, even if it is happening right before the game starts. But in campaign play, it might be more interesting to randomly determine their starting spells because then it tells a story of where you're going with that wizard. And as the games progress, you might look for magic items or upgrades or units that gel well with the randomness that happened, forcing you to do things that you don't normally do, which can be a lot of fun. I find in campaign games, I don't enjoy having one obvious choice that I have to take because if I choose anything else that's more thematic, it's going to hurt me in some meaningful way. That it's just so obvious that I'm doing something suboptimal by making a different choice. So that's where randomness can take away that anxiety and just let you enjoy yourself. I'll put this in the cons of randomness, but really it's the opposite. It's removing the randomness, is Warhammer 40K's current overuse of how many dice you're rolling and rerolls. So it is not uncommon now in 40K for you to be rolling 30 or 40 dice, and also having rerolls. It is quite common. And when I have my Gene Stealers walk up and charge and they get 40 attacks hitting on 2s, re-rolling, I know I'm getting 39 or 40 hits. Or that Space Marine Intercessor Squad, if they choose one target, now they get 4 shots and they get to re-roll because it's Oath of Moment. I know how many hits I'm gonna get. And with the +1 to wound on top of that, I know how many wounds I'm probably going to inflict as well. That, to me, there's not really any point to that. You might think, oh, no, they want to make the game more tactical, but you don't have to roll tons of dice for it to be tactical. If you're going to have rerolls, just have less dice. Or just why have randomness and then remove the randomness? That's my issue with that. It takes too long to roll that many dice and then re-roll them, only to have an outcome that is kind of predetermined. So if you're going to have randomness, have randomness. If you don't want to have randomness, then don't have randomness. Now, it might seem like I'm picking on Warhammer 40K, and obviously I am, because it's the game that we all know the most. It's a game that I've played since 4th edition, and I have loved, and I have hated, and I've loved again, and then hated again, and loved again, and hated, all back and forth. And so it's more like, I'll talk about the things I know the most. So, no offense, Games Workshop, but I'm gonna beat on your game more than others because, well, we all play it way more than others as well. So I guess that should be a compliment. You're welcome. Another one that's controversial that I actually think is a pro, but most likely most of you would think is a con, is a random game ending mechanic. In other words, do you play another turn? Or some other thing like that. This was prevalent in older editions of 40K, and I loved it, where you played 5 turns, and then on a 3+ you played a 6th turn, and on a 4+ you played a 7th turn. I love that because there were so many games where in the 5th turn, one player was winning, even though the other player was destroying them. Maybe they were holding more objectives at that point. They managed to push through and they're holding more objectives. But if you play another turn, they're just dead. But if you don't, they win. And yes, that means that the entire game is now down to a single dice roll that nobody has control over. But to me, since I was trying to tell a story, I was okay with that. Other people hated that. They wanted fixed game lengths. They wanted to know what was going to happen and when it was going to happen. Didn't like that. Now, in that same game, there was random reserves. In other words, you had a portion of your army that wasn't on the table and you randomly rolled to see if they showed up. I hated that so much because even if I was probably on average, rolling average, it never felt like it. You didn't notice when people showed up. You just noticed when they failed to show up, and there would be key units that just wouldn't show up. I paid points for them, and I only get to use them for a couple turns because they didn't show up till turn 4. And I really didn't like that. That doesn't mean I don't want them in a game. It's more like I didn't want them in every game, that I want to be able to have reserves that maybe I get to dictate which turn they come in. And maybe not first turn, maybe it's only second or third, kind of like the way it is now. So, same person who likes random game length didn't like random reserves. And you might like random reserves, but hate random game length. So obviously there's a bit of personal taste in here. What do you prefer? Leave a comment. In the end, it is the game designer's job to find the balance between the two. We want randomness in our games. Everybody does. Even chess has randomness. Who goes first, right? Obviously a lot less. But we don't want a game that plays itself, in that we just roll the dice and we really don't have control over what happens next. Like, could you imagine if you rolled to see if you could move, and if you rolled to see if you could shoot, and if you rolled to see if you could hold that objective and you rolled? Like, you don't want that. You want certain things just to be fixed. Like, I move 6 inches, therefore I move 6 inches. And I don't need to roll randomly how far I move. But maybe I'll roll randomly how far I run, because that's a little more unpredictable, or charges. Or maybe you don't want that. There has to be that balance between the two. It really comes down to what a game is trying to accomplish as well. If it's trying to be more tactical, less tactical, whatever it happens to be. So it's a hard choice. And then there's the question, of course, of which things should be more or less random. I'd love to hear all your thoughts about this, because really this can be a topic that, controversial isn't the right word, because come on, we're playing games here. But it can spark a lot of heated conversation about what a game should do. So let's have that heated conversation down in the comments. So that's really it. Thanks for watching. Happy wargaming.